I come from the United States, where everybody is taught that democracy, comes from the founding fathers who created the Declaration of Independence, Constitution. And, the amazing thing is if you actually look at the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, it doesn't say anything about America being a democracy. No one ever talks about this. And if you look at it, and you figure out why, you read the original documents, you realize that actually those guys hated democracy. They said so all the time. I actually saw the opening speech of the Constitutional Convention, where the people gathered together to create the American Constitution. And the first speech is by Governor of Virginia. He says, "We've got a real problem in this country. There's a real danger of democracy breaking out. There's democratic elements in a lot of the local constitutions. We've got to do something about this. What are we going to do to prevent democracy? We need to create a federal system, so forth and so on." So the entire constitutional project is an attempt explicitly to suppress democracy. Now, what do they mean by democracy? Well, they meant this. They meant people sitting around in squares, publicly discussing what to do and brainstorming ideas and resolving their own problems in an equal fashion. And why were they against it? They said very blatantly. I mean, John Adams, who was, I think, the third president, said, well, one man, one vote? Well, that's insane. You can't have democracy. We have like 10 million people with no property and 1 million people with property. What do you think's going to happen if you give these guys the vote? They're going to appropriate us right away. So they made very clear that there's no way you can have real democracy if you have vast inequalities of wealth without people actually undoing the inequalities of wealth. Now, what they have done over the last 200 years is figure out a way, to take these institutions which were basically created to stop democracy and convince everybody they are democracy, and B, to get people more and more involved in the system, since gradually they did expand it to one man, one vote, and still somehow not have them do the thing everybody was afraid that they were going to do in the beginning, which is expropriate the wealth. It's been one of the, millions and millions of very ingenious people have been working on how to do this for years. It's one of the greatest feats of propaganda ever done, but it's ultimately backed up by force. And the moment you really seriously challenge it, well, we all see what happens.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And so I just want us all to be aware that we need to acknowledge that the wealth and the deep intelligence and the deep understanding of what true democracy is comes from the native people of what I only call the USA, because you can't call it America, because America is a huge continent.
Yeah, well, one thing I would add to that, which people don't acknowledge, is most of the actual democratic elements that did end up in the American constitutional system originally come from Native Americans. I mean, the federal system is borrowed from Native Americans directly. And the story of what actually happened historically has really not been told, because we have this idea, we have these people who have just always been sort of these nature people, don't have politics of their own. But actually, when European settlers showed up in North America, what they really encountered was the result of hundreds of years of democratic movements within Native American societies. There are these vast kingdoms, in the Mississippian civilization, they're called, with caste systems, hierarchical, human sacrifice. Those things were overthrown. And they were overthrown by popular movements, which we're only now beginning to understand, that happened within indigenous societies, which then created a remarkably individualistic and egalitarian democratic system. I mean, a lot of the Enlightenment was actually borrowed from Native Americans directly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What do you think of systems like liquid democracy and other sort of internet sort of based democratic systems, if you know any, like delegative democracy, things like that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, should I answer your direct answer?
Yeah.
Okay. In this case, don't have much of a direct answer. I haven't really studied them. I mean, in my experience, social media, internet-based forms of democracy, they're really useful for spreading information and coordinating things, but I've yet to see a really good way to frame and make decisions collectively that doesn't involve at some point people sitting down together. And I think that I think that the technology is really useful to get people into the spaces where they can sit down together, and we can't have enough of that, but at some point people have to look in each other's eyes. Yeah.